Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and incredibly complex story that honestly gets overlooked way too often in global history. We're talking about the colonization of Australia. You know, when most of us think about Australia's origins, our minds immediately jump to that classic penal colony myth, right? The idea that it was basically just a giant, isolated prison. But as we'll see, the true story stretches so much further back, and it's far more intricate. We're going to look at how a continent claimed by a single empire, starting out as a literal dumping ground for convicts, grew into the prosperous modern nation it is today, all while examining the profound and often tragic impact this had on its entirely unique First Nations people.
Okay, let's look at our roadmap. First, we'll cover the First Nations and the Ice Age. Second, the search for the mythical southern continent. Third, the convicts and British settlement. Fourth, the cultural clash and its tragic consequences. And finally, number 5, the gold rush and the birth of the modern state.
Let's jump right into Section 1, First Nations and the Ice Age.
To really wrap our heads around Australia, we absolutely have to start the story long before European empires were even a thought. We're talking over 50,000 years ago. That's when the ancestors of the Aboriginal people first arrived on the continent. Back then, during the Ice Age, global sea levels were significantly lower than they are now, and this allowed these ancient ancestors to literally cross the ocean, navigating between islands in primitive boats. Now, once the Ice Age ended and those sea levels rose back up, the continent became incredibly isolated. Because of that extreme isolation, these First Nations developed a culture that was entirely unique, completely untouched by the rest of the world.
So just to paint a picture here, before Europeans ever set foot on the continent, it's estimated that up to 1 million people were living across Australia. It wasn't empty. They were divided into hundreds of distinct, smaller tribes. And get this, they had their own completely unique languages, cultures, and religions. It was a deeply oral culture, meaning all this rich history was passed down through stories, not written texts. They lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle, moving within specific boundaries set by rivers and trees, and they were absolute expert hunter-gatherers. What's truly remarkable is that they managed the land perfectly. They never overexploited it. They completely sustained themselves using Stone Age technology. No metalwork, no permanent cities, but perfectly in tune with their environment.
Moving on to Section 2, the search for the mythical southern continent.
Okay, so for thousands of years, this continent is just thriving in total isolation. So how did it finally pop up on the rest of the world's radar? Well, interestingly enough, the very name Australia actually comes from a Latin word for south. You see, ancient civilizations held onto this misguided but widely accepted geographical belief. They thought there absolutely had to be a massive continent way down south just to act as a physical counterweight to balance out Europe and Asia in the north. They were basically looking for a total myth, but eventually they bumped right into reality.
But charting this continent? That was an incredibly slow process. Now, there is some artifact-based evidence suggesting that Muslim sailors from Kilwa, which is in modern-day Africa, might have actually reached it back in the 14th century, but officially it was the Dutch who found it first in 1606 when explorer Willem Janszoon charted the coast. But here's the ironic part. The Dutch completely skipped colonizing it. Why? Well, to them, it just looked like a hostile, poisonous wasteland. It had no obvious trade value or resources, especially compared to their incredibly profitable, booming trade hubs right next door in Indonesia. It wasn't until the 18th century that British Captain James Cook arrived, mapped the eastern coast, and officially claimed it as New South Wales.
Which brings us to Section 3, Convicts and British Settlement. So, the big question is, why did the British finally decide to settle this seemingly uninviting land in 1788, when everyone else had pretty much just sailed away? Well, their motivations were actually highly strategic. They didn't just wake up and want a giant prison. Remember, they had recently lost their 13 American colonies to the Revolution, so they desperately needed a new colonial foothold to make up for that massive financial hit. At the exact same time, they were looking to rid their own society of what they considered a criminal class, thinking this would basically eliminate crime back home. But let's be clear, these weren't all hardened murderers. A lot of them were just petty thieves or rebellious Irishmen. For the British Empire, these convicts were the perfect, disposable, incredibly cheap, and often skilled labor force needed to literally build a brand new colony from scratch. Plus, it gave them a highly strategic naval base positioned safely south of Indonesia, perfect for disrupting enemy trade routes.
Now, as you might expect, trying to build a functioning colony out of deportees was pretty chaotic.
early settlement was defined by massive instability. I mean, you had uprisings by deported Irishmen whose only real goal was to steal a boat and sail right back home. But the absolute peak of this chaos is perfectly captured by the Rum Rebellion of 1808. This was an outright, actual military coup where the local army overthrew the colonial governor. And to this day, it remains the one and only successful armed takeover of government in all of Australian history. Pretty wild, right?
Okay, let's look at Section 4, Cultural Clash and Tragic Consequences.
Eventually, the British colony did stabilize, and they started expanding rapidly inland, building new towns. But as this expansion took hold, we hit the root of a massive ensuing tragedy. Basically, we had two completely incompatible worldviews colliding head-on. On one side, the Aboriginal peoples viewed the land through the lens of nomadic stewardship. For them, it was a deep, spiritual connection to vast territories with absolutely no physical fences. On the other side, the British operated on a system of hard borders, exclusive private property ownership, and aggressive agricultural expansion. Because these two groups simply couldn't communicate or even comprehend each other's fundamentally different concepts of existence, any chance of a peaceful coexistence vanished almost immediately.
And this British expansion had utterly devastating consequences. First and foremost were the European diseases that the colonists brought with them. The First Nations people had zero natural immunity, so these illnesses completely decimated the indigenous population, which obviously severely weakened their ability to resist the expansion. But on top of that, the British enacted some truly horrific, long-lasting policies aimed at forced assimilation. Colonists actively kidnapped Aboriginal children, completely severing their ties to their families and their ancient culture. It was a deliberate attempt to force them into European ways of life, and that is a deeply traumatic legacy that still impacts Indigenous communities today.
This aggressive territorial push triggered what are now known as the Frontier Wars, which spanned throughout the 19th and right into the early 20th centuries. And when you look at the casualty estimates, the disparity is immense. While roughly 2,000 European settlers died in these conflicts, the Aboriginal casualties are estimated to be somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000. It was just a brutal, devastating cycle. Aboriginal resistance trying to protect their ancestral lands was met with overwhelming military force and massacres by European settlers. The sheer loss of Indigenous life and culture during this era was staggering.
Now, for Section 5, Gold Rush and the Modern State.
Following those frontier conflicts, Australia experienced a massive economic boom that permanently altered the colony's demographic makeup and really forged the modern nation. Check this out. Between the 1860s and the 1890s, the population of Australia tripled. It surged from 1 million to 3 million people in just a few decades. So what caused this? A massive gold rush. The promise of sudden, life-changing wealth drew hundreds of thousands of eager, free prospectors from all over the globe. They all wanted to build a new life, and this influx was incredibly diverse. It even brought in a very significant Chinese minority, which fundamentally shifted the demographic reality of the entire continent.
So this incredible influx of free wealth effectively ended the whole penal colony era. By the 1860s, the very last convict ships arrived. And these newly wealthy prospectors? Yeah, they were not exactly keen on being heavily controlled by the British Crown. That tension actually led to a brief but famous miners' rebellion in 1854 against heavy taxation. The whole continent was transforming at lightning speed. By the late 19th century, Western Australia had even morphed into its own version of a Wild West. Ultimately, all of these shifting dynamics paved the way for the peaceful unification of the distinct Australian colonies into one single unified state in 1901. And eventually achieving partial independence from British laws by 1942.
Which brings us to exactly where Australia is today. It's an incredibly prosperous, wealthy nation, and culturally it remains very closely aligned with the West. Yet, a really profound question remains hanging over it. With Indigenous populations still facing systemic inequalities and dealing with the loss of so much ancient culture, how does a modern nation truly reconcile and heal the deep, lingering wounds of its complex foundation? It's not an easy answer, and it's a challenge that Australian society is still actively trying to navigate today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a clearer, more engaging look into the real history of Australia's colonization.